Hello, everybody. Welcome to another evening of conversation with our Out of Many series. I'm Adrienne Tarver, the Director of Programs here at the National Academy. This series is a series of conversations between our National Academicians who are participating in our digital annual exhibition, E Pluribus Out of Many, curated by Dr. Kelli Morgan. If you haven't already had a chance to explore the show, please do so when you have a chance. We are dropping the link to the exhibition in the chat. This exhibition contends with the challenge of creating a virtual exhibition, not just during a waning pandemic, not just amongst social upheaval and political turmoil, but also amongst a group of artists and architects who are as different as they are interesting. E Pluribus features over 100 national academicians and asks the question, what new futures can be created if Americans stop pursuing the ideal of national unity and accept our reality as an incongruent collective? Tonight, we're joined by artist Dred Scott and E Pluribus curator Dr. Kelli Morgan in conversation. Join us after the conversation for a Q&A with Dred and Kelli. You can use the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom screen throughout the conversation, and we'll make sure to get the questions to Dred and Kelli at the end. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Kelli Morgan. Kelli is the newly appointed inaugural director of curatorial studies and professor of the practice and history of art and architecture at Tufts University in Boston. She is a curator, educator, and social justice activist who specializes in American art and visual culture, and her scholarly commitment to the investigation of anti-Blackness within those fields has demonstrated how traditional art history and museum practice work specifically to uphold white supremacy. Dr. Morgan has held curatorial positions at the Indianapolis Museum of Art at Newfields, the Birmingham Museum of Art, and the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. She's held teaching positions at the Tyler School of Art and Architecture at Temple University, Wayne State University, and the University of Michigan, where she merged the classroom and the museum gallery to create various anti-racist paradigms for how curators can actively address the complexities of traditional art history, community engagement, and scholarly innovation. In 2014, Morgan was awarded a dissertation fellowship from the Ford Foundation and earned her PhD in Afro-American Studies and a graduate certificate in Public History Museum Studies from the University of Massachusetts Amherst in 2017. Hi, Kelli, good to see you again.
Adrienne, good to see you too. I'm always so excited about these.
Me too, I am as well. And I'm really excited for tonight. So I will let you get to it.
Yeah, without any delay, it is my esteemed pleasure to introduce Dred Scott today. Dred Scott is a visual artist whose works are exhibited across the US and internationally. In 1989, his art became the center of a national controversy over its transgressive use of the American flag, while he was still a student at the School of Art Institute of Chicago. Dred became part of a landmark Supreme Court case when he and others defied a federal law outlawing his art by burning flags on the steps of the US Capitol. And he's also presented a TED Talk, on this. His work has been included in exhibitions at MoMA PS1, the Walker Art Center, Kirsten Tierney Gallery, and is in the collection of the Whitney Museum and the Brooklyn Museum. He is a 2021 John Simon Guggenheim Fellow and has also received fellowships from Open Society Foundation and United States Artists, as well as a Creative Capital Grant. In 2019, he presented Slave Rebellion Reenactment, a community engaged project that reenacted the largest rebellion of enslaved people in US history. The project was featured in Vanity Fair, the New York Times, as well as on Christiane Amanpour's show on CNN, and highlighted by artnet.com as one of the most important artworks of the decade. Please join me in welcoming Dred Scott to our conversation tonight.
Thank you, Kelli. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. This should be good.
Yeah, it super should be. I'm gonna try not to fangirl out on you too much, because you have been such an inspiration to me. As I was in graduate school, and throughout my career, because you're somebody who really gets, I think, at the root of the problem. In this country, right, that we call home. When it comes to race, class, gender, just across the board. And you've taken a lot of hits, for that over your career as well. So it's like, it's not always, I like how you represent that, but then you are also very open about how doing that work, is not always beneficial, right?
So they don't like have Black communist revolutionaries having solo mid-career surveys at the Guggenheim, or you ain't well, but it's all right. It's all right. The people I'm like working for and caring about are the people that this whole system don't want in the room. So my existence is not too terrible.
Yeah, good. And so, with this show, I've been really trying to get, at some of those issues, titling it the way that I did, sort of arranging the galleries or like making the gallery themes. And your work really anchors, the first gallery, and the ways in which we like to tell ourselves, that unity is a thing, that we're invested in. And that we bring out that we actually do not, do really, really well, or really and truly that we haven't done at all. And I think, talk to us about the way, that your work, not just the work in the show, but that your work has often illustrated that, right? Or tried to demonstrate that, in visual ways for people.
Yeah, well, I think the question, is unity of whom, for whom, and who is the us? When you were talking, I was thinking back, I can't remember who did the routine, but I was basically talking about, back in the day they had this Lone Ranger show, and it's like, what do you mean we Kimosabi?
Yes.
It's like, nah, man, you could hold that bag if you want, but it ain't. But anyway, so the thing is, I think a lot of my work is talking about the world as it is, how it got here, and with a lot of emphasis on getting people to confront and reassess a lot of the cohering ideas of American society, and often to imagine how the world could be radically different and far better. It's like, so America is a country that was founded on slavery and genocide. That's what America is. A lot of people talk about, hey, this is a democracy or whatever. It's like, well, yeah, the political structure is democracy, but let's not forget that the people who conceived of the democracy for this country, they were slave owners. They were enslavers. That's fundamentally what they were. George Washington was president because he was the biggest enslaver in the country at the time. That's why he got the vote of his fellow enslavers and friends of enslavers. And the US Constitution is a document that was written by enslavers and friends of enslavers to define the legal and political framework of a society whose economic foundation is slavery. And so I've been talking about this country and the connection between sort of that origin, those foundations, and how you get to Derek Chauvin kneeling on George Floyd's neck for what I'm doing now. For the history of my art. That said, the question of unity is, this country, wants to have people united around, America, apple pie, baseball, and American democracy and belief of invading countries, occupying countries, oppressing whole people, and ignoring the history of how this country has brutalized and exploited people. Yeah. If people can get with that and say, hey, I can be, like Black folk can be like the next Colin Powell and say, hey, I embrace all of that and I'm going to go bomb the people of Iraq, then yeah, you can be an American and you could be united around that. I'm not interested in that unity. The unity I'm interested in is people who actually don't want to have anything to do with claiming that history. And so I think my work is actually about unity, but it's not about on the basis of unity as Americans. It's on the basis of unity with the people of the world and talking on that basis deeply about what America is and imagining, helping people conceive of how can you get beyond that? How do people, particularly people who want revolution, people who see that the world doesn't have to be the way that it is, where a tiny handful of people control the great wealth and knowledge that humanity as a whole has created. How can we get together and radically change that? And so I think my work is about unity. It's just not the unity of the American people to uphold America.
Yeah, it's like, I think, it's not about the unity of like the mythology. The unifying thread has always been a lie. and and I know we were talking the other day about this, right? Where,
Yeah.
I run into that, as a curator of American art all the time. Because whenever I try to disrupt that, that mythology and that narrative through reading like a canonical Benjamin West, right? Or a canonical Gilbert Sully, through to do exactly like what you just said, it's like the institutions just implode, and so something else that had come up, in our conversation the other day too, is like how that is always read through doing the work, like imbibing my identity politics, in the work. And something you said then that I wanted to kind of bring, to the larger group today was like how your response is always like, this is about you, right? Like as a Black person, I do have, kind of skin in the game, quote unquote, or so to speak. But it's like, no, this is really about you. And I find myself saying that, to museum directors, right, and trustees over and over and over and over again.
Yeah, when I do a project like, a piece, that we may talk about at some point is a man was lynched by police yesterday. And a lot of people say, oh, this is about your Black identity. It's like, nah, this ain't about my identity. This is about America. Yeah. This is about the connection between lynch mobs and police. I ain't either one of those things. My people haven't been one of those things. It's about America, and it's about American history. And so, it's like this whole, how American ideals, including with white supremacy, is constructed and perpetuated, including at the museum level. I mean, it's like a while back, I did a talk at the Met Museum. It was actually a really cool talk about Jacob Lawrence and the Struggle series, but as part of preparation for that, and the Sylvia Yount, one of the sort of organizers and curators of the American Wing, we talked, and she's a really interesting curator. And so we went to the American Wing. And so the big giant thing, and there's, Washington crossing the Delaware. And it's like, it's this, probably 15 foot by 10 foot painting or something like, it's huge. And it's like, and that's what you get when you like want to study American art. Yes. And it's like, well, okay, well, why was Washington crossing the Delaware in the first place? It's like, was not that the enslaver Washington who was leading troops to fight for, American independence and to create the American nation against the King of England, who, the Americans were saying in Washington and the Declaration of Independence that one of the great crimes of the King of England was he incited the savages, meaning the indigenous people who happened to live in what became the United States, to fight against them and encourage slave revolts. I'm like, well, those two things seems kind of good to me, and so how do these museums and sort of reinforce that particular mythology of the greatness of America as its origin story and coming up to present? And it was I just coincidentally happened to be at a talk last night that Nicole Hannah-Jones just had a book launch for 1619 Project, and it's very simple. It's like, all right, 1619, that's the origin story of America. It's not 1776, and it's not even 1620. It's slavery coming with the European colonists, and actually enslaved people were here even before that. For the English were here, but that's a different story. But this whole question of like, how does the art that we are discussing and that I make get put into that canon and that dialogue and that discourse, or not? How does it get excluded from that?
Yeah, because I'm working on a huge project right now with independent scholar Tyler Green. That's where we're trying to do just that, like looking at colonial American art till about the 1920s, and the way in which it's not historicized properly at all, and it maintains this white supremacy. It really structures whiteness. It constructs whiteness, and then it shifts, based on how our national or like federal definitions of citizenship shifts. And it's been fascinating, the conversations that Tyler and I have been having with people, where like people we couldn't pay, right, to talk to us a year ago, are like talking to us now. Other thing, we've kind of, had some conversations with some funders. So it's like, it's getting kind of the sea legs under it. And like really having to explain to people, because they're so used to get like laying that responsibility on contemporary artists or contemporary curators.
Yeah.
You know, and I think there's this sentiment in American art where like, well, we don't do that because that's what the mod con people do.
Yeah.
You know, and it's like, no, the mod con people, first of all, like that's problematic in and of itself, right? But it's like mod con museum professionals shouldn't have to bear the burden, you know, of basically the last 250 years, you know, that you all have like, you know, maintained this lie.
Yeah.
You know, and it's crazy.
But then counterposed against that, I mean, I'd love to actually get into talking about slave rebellion reenactment, which is sort of is a way to sort of, you know, because some people are thinking about American history a certain way, and I'm thinking about it a different way. And for those that don't know, and, you know, maybe we should show some of the work as I talk, but slave rebellion reenactment was a community engaged performance that I did that was brought to the public in November of 2019 that reenacted the largest rebellion of enslaved people in US history. And actually hold on this image for a while, because I just want to say, because a lot of times when I say, oh, you reenacted a slave rebellion, it's like, well, in 1811, enslaved people tried to seize all of Orleans territory, which is all of modern day Louisiana, and set up an African republic in the New World. And it was this beautiful vision of trying to get free by ending slavery. So when I say I'm doing a slave rebellion reenactment, a lot of people say, oh, well, you know, they think of Civil War reenactment and just thinking of flipping the script, which that's important. But as a visual artist, part of what I'm interested in is how this talking about this past resonates in the present. A lot of times I tell people my work looks at both how the past sets the stage for the present, but how it resides in the present in new form. So this photograph that is a performance still from this project, you know, there are all these oil refineries in the background. And it's like, it's not like I wanted to remove those, but couldn't because I didn't have Hollywood budget and I couldn't find a place to do this. This project sort of has the past commingling with the present. So this is in a region, the rebellion was the reenactment was site responsive. And so in 1811, this would have been a levee that with a sugar plantation, and now there's an oil refinery sitting on top of it. And the oil refiners literally put down where there were sugar plantations, and often a lot of them are put down on the graves of enslaved people. And so that history of like, well, what was sugar plantations is now another form of toxic extractive industry that is literally killing the descendants of enslaved people, because this region has 50 times the highest cancer rate of other regions in the United States. And so I'll continue talking a little bit more, but I just wanted to point out that this is a really iconic image. So if we can keep scrolling as I talk with a couple more of the images. So this was reenacted. It was a community engaged performance. People got connected up to this. This was not me hiring a bunch of actors. This was people in the community who wanted to connect and embody this history of freedom and emancipation. This was not a project about slavery. This was a project about freedom and emancipation. And so, you know, we sort of, you know, metaphorically attacked slave owners and then killed some white folk. We had battle scenes. We had marching for 24 miles over the course of 2 days. And so if you were going to work or coming home from work or going shopping or whatever, you might see this beautiful army of the enslaved, the Black and indigenous people in period costume, chanting on to New Orleans, freedom or death, we're going to end slavery, join us. And this was as much for the reenactors as for the audience. And so the reenactors that were embodying this history and making new connections and figuring how this history, how embodying this history of freedom and emancipation resonated for them and how they embody that in the present. And so if we can continue the next slide. And so these are some of the performance stills actually on view at Kristen Tinnery Gallery. If you're in New York for the next month, you could see the performance stills and some of the flags from the performance. This is me talking with one of the reenactors, this amazing drummer and cultural bearer named Luther Gray, about performing in this. And it was conversations with 21st century people about why this 19th century history of freedom and emancipation matter. And then Luther and his people, he would talk to other people about, yeah, you should get with this, you should participate. And so he recruited a bunch of drummers, and other people brought other people into the army of the enslaved. And so if we can get the next slide. And this is just one of the flags that was designed. We knew that in 1811, we knew the size of the army, and we knew that it was actually a disciplined army, and we knew that they marched in formation with flags, because one of the generals, the US generals, wrote to the governor to say all of that. but we didn't have a description of what the flags were. So I had to imagine what they might have been. And so there were people from all different regions of West Africa, from Senegambia. There were Igbos and Mandingos, and there were a few Chromanity, but not so many Chromanity, but there were Yorubas, there were Congos. And so we had to think, how would people who might have had various cultural linguistic differences, might have even been at war with each other, what flags might they have made to unite themselves and to fight against a common foe, the enslavers in New Orleans. And so this was one that drew on some of both Yorubas, but also Congos would have believed in Shango in some form. And so this was a sort of a double-headed axe that was sort of representing people who might have been followers of Shango. And if we can get the next slide, I think we could actually have a brief 1-minute video of what it looked like kind of live. Okay, so, this was what this project was. And I think this question of how do people think of history in the United States? How do Afro-descendant, how do Black people figure into that history? Are we sort of an asterisk in it, or are we foundational to it? Because I think that you actually can't understand the modern world, and certainly not the United States, if you don't know about slavery, and you can't understand slavery if you don't know about slave revolts. And so these were these visionary rebels. If you want to study freedom and emancipation, you don't go to George Washington and enslaver. You actually go to Charles Delans and Cook and Kimana and Mari Rose, who were, sort of slave rebel leaders that saw that the only way you can get to a just society is to overthrow the system of enslavement. And so this project actually, talks about all those sorts of things. I mean, it's something that is trying to, if it gets into sort of the art canon in a certain sense, then it actually changes how people look, but what the role of artists is, but also how people look at this history and what art can be, what forms does art take? Because it's like, this is not just a painting, it's a community engaged performance, but it's actually very accessible, and it talks about history from a very different perspective. So I like to think that it is sort of, what, Robert Colescott or Leon Gollum might be doing if they were performance artists today.
No, absolutely. Did you find that people outside of the reenactors got that, got the thread of the vestiges, of how that history is still very much so happening, right? How we're still living it. But then how it's transformed into a different version, right, of oppression. Is people get that?
Well, I mean, first off, so let's get the slides down so we can have us a little bit bigger on the screen, and we can come back to the slides in a bit. But yeah, I mean, so, I think a lot of people did get it on a certain level, because if you're, driving to work at the oil refinery, or you're coming to your gated community or your trailer park, and you see, 350 Black and Indigenous people with some antiquated weapons and outdated clothing, you're like, what the hell am I looking at? What is this? And then, you might not know all the history, but it's everybody kind of, particularly in that region, knows that sort of slavery and Black people had a little bit something to do with the early part of this country. You might not know a whole lot about it, and you probably have a sort of inkling that white supremacy, even though you might not talk about it in those terms, has something to do with, say, monuments which were being taken down in New Orleans at the time, or names of schools that are named after enslavers, and or the highway, Jefferson Davis Highway, that you're driving on. You might have some sort of clue, even if you're not a student of history, that there might be some connection between people that are doing an artwork, or maybe as I understood it, a film, with these, the slave rebellion and the present, and the killing of, say, Philando Castile, or Alton Sterling. Alton Sterling was killed in Baton Rouge, which is not that far, from there. And so you're going to have a conversation. You might talk to your friends, like you were going to work. Maybe you were a little bit late because there was a traffic or something like that. You meant, man, I was late because these guys were doing this. What's all that about? Well, didn't you remember they told us there was going to be this performance or movie or something about slavery or something like? Oh yeah, I get it, man. I wish they'd stop talking about that. Slavery's from the past. No, man, slavery's actually with us. What are you talking about? It's the past. And so then you've got a conversation. It's like a lot of people don't necessarily know that they want contemporary art. They might not even know what it is, but when they encounter it, I mean, at least, the kind of work that I do, I think there's a lot of meat on the bones for people to engage. And so people that might have an MFA or a PhD or be curators or hang out at museums a lot might have a different understanding of some of the connections in history. They might be able to say, oh, well, this is like Jeremy Deller's Battle of Orgreave, or, oh, this kind of relates to the storming of the Winter Palace that Circe Eisenstein did. Or they might say, well, this is like community engaged work that other people have been doing. But you don't need all of that to talk about what this project was about. And the people who encountered it, I mean, there's this beautiful image of this that was recorded. The Guardian newspaper in the UK did a video about this project. And it's just a news story, a 7-minute video. If people are interested, they could see it on my website, dredscott.net. But this woman, we basically came across her house. I mean, she lived in a trailer, and it wasn't a trailer park, but she had a trailer on her land. And she said, oh my God, I am so glad that y'all are doing this. Nobody ever talks about this history. Thank you for doing this. And then she said, my family, this land has been in my family for generations. And people kind of ignore us. And you are doing that. And then she went on to say, later she informed us that she had just gotten out of the hospital from surgery a couple days earlier. And so this was something that was like, it brought joy to her heart. I don't know all of what she thought about it. We didn't have a substantive, lengthy conversation, but she got it. And I think people do get some of this. And so, there is a way in which if your aim is to make art that ordinary people can have access to about questions that are of concern to a range of people, they can get it. You don't need to go to an art school to understand this artwork. I mean, yes, you might need to go to an art school to make this artwork and be an artist, to have the ideas for how to do it and where to get funding but yeah, to understand it, if the artist does their job right, people get it.
Yeah, and that's the beauty. That's the one thing that I love about artists. Is being able. I always say, when I had the conversation with Sangram, I was saying, like, you guys can make, you make the tangible, or you make the intangible tangible. Whether it's history, whether it's emotion, feeling. And I just kind of like, we need that, and we always kind of, we talk about like the kind of highbrow, like, reason why artists are important to society, and not that stuff isn't, true, but it's this kind of stuff that, like, I think gets into like the meat and potatoes, of just regular, like you said, everyday people, who have access, who have a type of, have their own body of knowledge, right? And they have their own entry point to it. And that's, this is something that I'm always like so angry about in museums, because I think we cut off that access point to certain classes of people and, certain races of people, the whole nine. But doing work, like yours, that just, like you said, just puts it out there, in a way that people can recognize it, whether they kind of know what it is or not, and it creates a space. And that's something that I think we should do all the time. It's amazing to me, how museums don't really, they don't invest in it.
And I mean, I think that's a real shame, because it's like, particularly at a time when a lot of museums are, grappling for their relevance. It's like, why do we exist, and trying to do audience development. And some of them, with the best of intentions, want to diversify both, their boards, their senior staff, and their collection, and their audience. And I think there's, it's like, I think some museums are disingenuous when they say that, but I think some actually want to. But then there's the question, well, how do you do that? What work do you show? How do you invite the audience in? What do you need to do that? And I think it's obviously not a simple question, but it ain't that difficult.
It ain't that hard. Yeah, I always say it's not rocket science, people.
Yeah.
And the analogy I like to use, is I'm like, I use like a development analogy, right? And I'm like, your development officers, can tell you what preschool, our high level donors grandkids went to in 1960. Seriously, and I was like, but we can't find, Black people to engage that live a mile down the road, like, get out of here. So I'm always challenging them on terms of like you said, genuity, like how genuine they are, in that one, seriously, because it's like, really,
Yeah. So let's show a couple of the other images that we got in the slideshow, because I think that some of the questions we're talking about access and audience, and could be all right. Yeah.
No, I was like, I totally wanted to talk about this.
Okay. So this is an ad for an artwork. And so the highlights of the ad are: to be sold, one from a cargo of 94 prime healthy whites. And so this was a remake of an ad for a sale of prime healthy Negroes. And those ads, for people who don't know, and I think some of you might not, if you have a society where slavery is the foundation, and, you'll have ads for all sorts of things, including for selling people. And so, sales of Negroes or slaves were just common. There are tons of them out there. And so I kind of flipped the script on that for this next piece. If you can go to the next slide. So this was an NFT that is a looped 1 minute, 10-second video of a white male for sale. It's called White Male for Sale. And so there was a white male who stood on an auction block in blackest Brooklyn, and the video just loops continually, and people walk by, and here's this guy being auctioned. And then the NFT was completed. It was a conceptual NFT. So the prime thing was this video, but the next part of it, if you can go to the next slide.
Trev, really quickly, can you explain what an NFT is for people?
I will. Yeah, I will. And so the NFT was sold at auction at Christie's. And so an NFT stands for non-fungible token. Most of the world heard about it in March of last year, when a dude named Beeple sold an NFT for $69 million at Christie's. And it is a way, it is thought of as a new genre of art for digital art. And people say that it is a way for artists to establish ownership of digital things. Because the thing is, if you've got a painting is sort of somewhat inherently unique. The brush strokes are unique and stuff like that. With a JPEG or a video or a sound piece, they're easy. One copy of a JPEG is the same as another copy of a JPEG. And so if you make digital art, you do have a problem. Like, what's the original if you're trying to monetize that? And so an NFT was a way to establish a record of ownership. It's basically a high-tech digital certificate of authenticity. And on a more technical level, an NFT is just a record of ownership that exists on a blockchain, blockchain is just a fancy word for a public record that is accessible, that is and not forgeable. And that record points to some folder on the internet somewhere. So there's a lot of mystery about actually what NFTs are. They think, oh, I've got an NFT that's this video, or I've got an NFT that's this tweet, or I've got an NFT that's this JPEG or this GIF. And really it is establish a public record of ownership of it and some folder somewhere that could have hundreds of JPEGs in it, it could have movies, it could have movies and JPEGs. But the thing is, when this sort of Beeple NFT came out, the world heard about this and they're like, oh, I got to get me an NFT. I want an NFT. And I, because I do a lot of reading and thinking about enslavement and slavery, heard the word NFT was specifically non-fungible token differently than a lot of people, because many people, fungible is not a super common word in English, in the English language. I mean, many people might know what it means, but they haven't used it in a sentence in the past few years. But I had, because people that talk about slavery talk about how, particularly the early days of slavery, they tried to turn people into commodities, particularly the Spanish and the Portuguese, and they wanted to make them fungible. And so if you look at early history of slavery, was the Portuguese and the Spanish, they came up with this concept called a piece of India, whereby actual people were compared against an idealized slave. And so if you were an enslaver in Brazil and you needed to wanted 100 people to cut cane for you, to grow and cut cane, sugar cane, you might ask the slave trader for 100 pieces of India, which would mean you might get 100 people, but you might get 130 people or something like that, because this idealized piece of India is this idealized 16 to 25-year-old healthy male. But if you got, say, a 42-year-old male or a 26-year-old female with 2 children, or a male that might have had yellow fever, that would be compared to this idealized one piece of India, and that you might actually be worth 2/3 of a piece of India, or a third of a piece of India. So if you're this enslaver asking, you don't ask for 100 people, you ask for 100 pieces of India, and you might get 130 people. And so, and in American, if you look at American slave traders' records, they are trying to look, I've got a number 1 slave, I've got 4 number 3 slaves, and a couple number 2 slaves for sale. So again, it's this idealized ranking of people that actual people get compared against, and potential buyers are thinking, I can do with this idealized, this actual person what I want, but this is like not a perfect idealized perfect real person. This is a number 2 person, and so I will do with them different things than I might do with this idealized number 1 person.
And I want to add to that too, like the way that specific system, affected Black women, into almost, like into perpetuity, because they would sell them based on their reproductive capabilities, right? So they were worth more, depending on how young they were. Because the estimate, again, like based on that scale, was like, oh, she'll be able to have 14 or 16 or 18, kids to increase your wealth. Go ahead.
And they also, they were also talking about it in terms of basically how rapeable they were. Because the enslavers were not just, sort of disgustingly breeding people. They were like, oh, I want to fuck this woman. And so, there's the whole commodification of female sexuality, but also in terms of, oh, you can show this one off. I'm not just going to fuck her in private. This is going to be my mistress. She's going to be, and so it is, the slavery, the commodification of people and ranking of what they were actually going to do, but that's what it is. And people should talk about that more, which is why I made this NFT, because I'm like, all right, you want to talk about sort of, fun, the thing is,
so if you want to talk about it, like, let's actually talk about where, like, how it originated in the first place.
Yeah. And basically capitalism in its early stage turned things that are inherently unique, people, into fungible objects. Okay. And now the art world is trying to turn things that are not unique, I like a JPEG or a piece of music, into something that is commodifiable, where you frankly don't even care about what the underlying aesthetic is, but you're just looking at what it sells for. And so I wanted to make this work that, like, let's talk about fungibility and the history of capitalism and how that distorts and perverts absolutely every relationship that we have, both where you can buy people, but also even thinking about art where it's just another commodity. And so let's go back to the roots, and that's That's why with the NFT as a conceptual artwork, the sale at Christie's was part of the artwork and completed it. So as an artist, I can say, well, actually, I'm not just interested in, you know, the JPEG, but actually thinking about the NFT, the point of ownership and sale and transformation into commodities of this artwork happening at, you know, an auction of a white dude as artwork is part of the artwork. So
yeah. You know, and then I think, you know, kind of like you and Adrian were talking before, you know, we went live about the way in which the market, you know, artists are always finding themselves being screwed, you know, by the market because of how, right? Because of this system and like literally how it's set up. So whether it's secondary market and auction houses, you know, and money going to collectors and not artists, or even the way art, you know, contemporary artists like themselves are constantly, right, undersold, you know, in like, you know, all of the problematics and dealing with galleries, you know, and having that middleman too. And the way that, you know, this was kind of posited, you know, as a way for artists to maintain, right, another type of economic autonomy. But because the market is structured in the way that it is, it still, you know, works to can still work to undermine the artists.
And one of the reasons people talk about NFTs as giving economic autonomy to artists is because there's this thing called a smart contract that can be part of an NFT, where artists can basically establish that anytime a work is resold. So a lot of time what happens, anytime the work is resold, the artist gets a percentage. And so in the traditional art world, an artist might sell a painting, say for $10,000 to some dude. They're hungry. They could use the $10,000. They're happy. But then that dude says, oh, well, now it's worth $1 million. I'm going to flip this, and the artist doesn't get anything.
Right.
And so with the smart contract, supposedly the artist is going to get 10% or whatever the artist establishes. And so people have been like, oh yeah, this is going to be great for artists, because artists can just sell directly to the collector. And then if that collector flips it, then the artist will get paid. And I'm like, well, yeah, but the whole question of distribution networks, creation of value and stuff, that doesn't go away just because you have the technology to make it. And I'm still waiting to see how many artists get how much resale value. I think some people are, you know, going to be fine, but I think, you know, the whole structures of the art world have not disappeared with the invention of the NFT.
Yeah, totally. Hi, Adrian.
Hi, I mean, I heard my name and I would have joined sooner. I had to change locations because my Wi-Fi is not behaving. So if I suddenly go robotic, I apologize to everybody. But I also want to apologize for starting the conversation in our like virtual green room. You know, I sort of broke the cardinal rule. Like, it shouldn't ask a question that pertains to the conversation before we're open to the public. But I did want to kind of jump into this NFT conversation because we did start it in our virtual green room. And I wanted to ask a question related to this idea of accessibility, because we did, you were talking in relationship, I think, to the slave rebellion reenactment about accessibility and sort of that being a piece that's out in the public. And then this conversation of NFTs. And, you know, it's, I think, a really interesting topic to debate. And I'm curious about your thoughts on accessibility of NFTs. And I will just preface that with thinking about it from like the ability to make it, like artist accessibility to the creation of it, because it's actually not super straightforward, and the sort of public accessibility, sort of the audience perspective of that.
Yeah. Well, for artists to create it, it's actually not that difficult. It's a little harder than it needs to be now, because there's still a learning curve in, you know, how to make them. But the bigger question is, there are places like Makerspace or Nifty Gateway or OpenSea or Foundation, where you can basically go to one of these companies and say, I want to mint an NFT. You basically, you know, you have to have real currency, US dollars, converted to digital currency. And typically that is Ethereum. It's like Bitcoin, if you don't know what Ethereum is, but you have to have that converted, and then you have to have a digital wallet to have that. But then once you have all that, it's easy to go to one of these companies and say, I've got this artwork. I want to make an NFT, and you give them money and they make it. What's a little bit more complicated is that they don't really tell you how that ties you to them in a certain way and what cut they get and how that smart contract, what's in that smart contract. And so there are issues that people are needing to consider as this growing landscape of art gets developed, but it's not that hard if you want to do it to make one. There are issues in terms of making them that, I mean, they are terrible for the planet. I mean, the amount of electricity that's consumed making an NFT is equivalent to the amount of electricity I would use in my apartment for 2.5 months. Just like, and so it's, if you're trying to figure out, well, wait a minute, the world is on fire right now. California's burning, Canada's burning, there are locust plagues someplace else, there are floods in, the New Orleans and New York and Germany. Maybe we need to do something about climate change. NFTs are not the way to do that. We don't need these from that perspective. And so there is that question in terms of accessibility. If you want to make one that is, aligned with your ethics, that's an issue. And then as far as seeing them, anybody who has access to the internet, which is not everybody, and it definitely skews to people in advanced industrialized parts of the world. But but for those that do, you can, anybody watching this could look at NFTs if they want to. And so, it's getting easier for better or worse. I mean, I think that NFTs are at least going to be around for a little bit of time. I'm not as enthusiastic as some people are about them. I mean, I've made one and I like my NFT a lot, but I think that, in its current form, I hope that they don't continue to stay around the way they are, but people can have access to them if you've got basically a web browser to look at them. But most people don't know, well, if I wanted to see some NFTs, where would I do it? Or if I wanted to see good NFTs, how would I, see those? Like, if I go to, let's say I want to, let's say I like Jasper Johns. I know that if I go to the Whitney Museum or the Philadelphia Museum of Art right now, I could see some pretty good Jasper Johns, and somebody's picked the good ones and put them in a nice lighting. Or if I say, well, I always know that if I go to the new museum, I'm going to find some interesting stuff. I don't know what I'm going to see, but I might find something interesting. With NFTs, it's kind of like, well, it's just an open field of what you have to find what you consider good. And so, the spaces aren't super curated. Some of these places like Foundation is a curated space. But yeah, there are issues of, for better or worse, connoisseurship or curation that suddenly get into play, because there's hundreds of thousands or millions of NFTs out there if you want to see them, but just like there's hundreds of thousands or millions of paintings and drawings, and it's like, how do you find the good ones and that align with your concerns and aesthetic is more the question. But it is accessible, but as you were talking earlier, when we needed to define even what the term NFT is, a lot of people don't know what these things are. So that will change somewhat, and how the art world deals with it and decides to show or not show them. Most of them I wouldn't want to see in many of the galleries and museums I go to. I think, the aesthetic is not my aesthetic, but I think some are actually starting to push in that direction. And like all the stuff that's in this Beeple in NFT, which is 5,000 individual artworks, it's terrible. I wouldn't want to look at that. It's both sexist and it's racist, but it's also bad aesthetically. There's a lot of really good sexist aesthetic stuff that's good, that's sexist. And it's like, has anybody seen surrealist art? Well, it's kind of misogynist, but it's good work. And so I would not say that about Beeple. I would not make the argument that, oh yes, this is ideologically repugnant, but has redeeming aesthetic value. That's not the argument that I'm going to make. And I think most people that are in the section of the art world that I kind of run in would view things the same way. So it's like, there is a question of how does the art world deal with this, when what the excitement is about is what did it sell for?
Right. Well, and I think that it's a trap that the art world falls into a lot, that the market and finances drive a lot of the media coverage. But I do think in this conversation, again, we had what we were talking about before in the sort of green room section, was the idea, like I became excited, I think, about the potential of NFTs when I saw your work come out, because then it was like that conceptual connection of auctioning something in this virtual space and like sort of creating that bridge between history and our sort of current capitalist, operating system felt like it hit the mark, whereas it was very hard to be excited about NFTs, and to be quite frank. And I had a friend really try hard to get me to be excited about NFTs, and it was really hard to like want to be in that conversation until I started to understand like the potential, and that like what artworks can sort of like rise through all of the noise, because there's a lot of noise. There's so we did drop a link. Thank you, Angelique. We dropped a link in the chat to view Dread's NFT. So we had a question from Leslie Dill about being able to see it. So you can see that. Also, if you Google it, there's going to be lots of media coverage over it. So you'll find lots of articles and people talking about it. And please, just a reminder to everybody, if you have questions for Dread, speak now. This is your moment. Drop it in the Q&A and we will make sure to answer it. So maybe if you could tell us a little bit while we're on NFTs, so also audience, if you want us to stop talking about NFTs, this is your chance to have something else. But while we're on NFTs, I am curious about like that moment of decision between like, there's all of this noise, all of this conversation, and like, I'm going to do it. This is what I'm going to do. And like that process.
Well, the process was super short for me. When I heard of Beeple thing, I mean, I literally like, well, fungible, wait a minute, what are we talking about? This $69 million for what? Fungible? Slavery? And it's like, so that happened in March. By April, by mid-April, I had the video already shot and the idea of like, I want Christie's to auction this. And we couldn't work it out to get into the spring auctions, which is really where I wanted it. And I wanted it there because it would have actually been much, I mean, everybody, every art publication was, every day was talking about NFTs back in April and May. And I wanted as a artist that deals a lot with social questions, I wanted to be part of that conversation in a way that I knew that it wouldn't be quite the same if it was in the fall auction, which is where it ended up, because Christie's was, had some concerns. It's like, well, Dred Scott's never been at auction. Is this going to sell? Is anybody going to be interested? And my thinking was, well, first of all, I get why that's your concern. I'm not as concerned about that. But also, quite frankly, if you put this in the spring auction, it's going to sell because people are going to be hyped about it. And it will have much more social implication and weight and be more part of the conversation that I actually want to have. But then that would also probably, it would probably sell more. But it did sell, and that's good. But in terms of the process, though, it was very, very quick. I mean, it was like, I want to talk about this because this is a hustle. This is kind of a scam with what NFTs are. And I think that as an artist who's always trying to look at how people can, re-examine a lot of the cohering ideas of the society, this was an opportunity to talk about some really, pretty foundational questions that I was like, okay, let's do this quickly. Yeah,
that makes a lot of sense. And I think the quick turnaround, I mean, also in those beginning months of NFTs, I was very skeptical about how long they would stick around. So trying to get it out quickly makes sense. We do have a question here from Leslie Wayne. She says, I was intrigued by your imaginary flags for the Slave Rebellion reenactment. Can you talk about how you came up with the specific designs?
Okay, so yeah, that's a great question. And again, if people want to see more of the flags, I would encourage those that you live in New York to go to Kristen Tierney Gallery. There's a show of the performance stills on the flags that's up for another month, up till December 18th. But the flags, I mean, as I said, that we knew that they had flags, but we didn't know what they were. So I looked at research on what previous slave rebellions had flags and that we knew about. And so the one thing that was common is a lot of them had flags with text on that said either liberty or death or liberty. And so there was one that said, mourir or liberté in Louisiana Creole, because that was it was not French, it was Louisiana Creole. So we wrote it in that. But then I had to think, well, look, people in that region, some of them would have come from Saint-Domingue, which became Haiti. Some of them might have actually been from Haiti, because the revolution happened was completed in 1804, and this rebellion happened in 1811. So, some may have been from Haiti, some may have been from other parts of the United States, but the predominant people were from West Africa. This was 1811. The internet, the transatlantic trade in people still existed basically for a lot of people were coming. And so there were people from, the Ivory Coast, the Gold Coast, Senegambia. And so I looked, and there were Congos, there were Yorubas, there were people, people from the Asante Kingdom that would have had, there might have been Igbos, there would have been Fan and all sorts of people. And I was trying to think, well, okay, what if you were at war with the person who you're now a field hand with?
Yeah.
What is going to enable you to say, all right, we got to put our past hostilities down because our current oppressor is the one we got to fight against? What do we have in common? And, what symbols might speak across languages? And so with Congos and Yorubas, they actually sort of shared orishas, particularly with Ogun or Gu. And so one of the flags was that. There was a symbol that I drew that came in a language that is a pictographic language that's used by some of the secret societies that are in the region that became Nigeria. That was a symbol that was found in Havana in the late 1800s. That, this is after the 1811 rebellion, but perhaps that symbol might have existed in some form in 1811. I don't know. And so as an artist, I both had the necessity to invent flags because we didn't have descriptions of what the flags were, but also because I was interested in the past existing in the present in new form. I could actually imagine things that may or may not have existed, but in a speculative way, and draw on some of the techniques that would have been available for people then, because the one that used this symbol of war and blood that was found in Havana, it's basically a wax resist indigo dye. So it's a hand dyed indigo in 1811 that would have been cassava resist and not a wax resist, but the effect would have been the same. There were other symbols that used indigo. Indigo was cultivation and harvesting and dyeing with indigo was a technique from West Africa. That's how it got to the Americas, and New Orleans in particular. The main crop that was being grown and harvested prior to the Haitian Revolution was indigo. And then when the main sugar producer in the world was sort of taken offline by the Haitian Revolution, the enslavers in French colonial society said, well, okay, we can move our operation to New Orleans. The climate is similar, and we don't need a visa to go there because we've already got a colony set up in New Orleans. And so they said, well, switch out the indigo, start growing sugar. But the technology and understanding and access to indigo was still there. So the two of the flags use indigo as their main color. And just thinking through some of that history to how would people have united to fight, and how could you make something that's both referencing that past but thinking about the future and also be beautiful.
So we have another question that brings us back to NFTs, and this is more about the actual logistics of how they work. So this is from Babs Reingold. Thanks for bringing up the climate change issue associated with the NFT. Is it the Bitcoin itself that is the electricity hog? Do I understand that correctly? This is about the mining, right?
Yeah. Well, okay. So first off, the NFTs are NFTs are on what's called the Ethereum blockchain, and Ethereum is a cryptocurrency like Bitcoin, but it's not the same as Bitcoin. And so the underlying technology behind Bitcoin doesn't actually allow for creating tokens that are not Bitcoin, whereas Ethereum does. And so you can create NFTs on the Ethereum blockchain. But the actual mining of Bitcoin and Ethereum, as well as writing records on the blockchain, is energy intensive. The designers of these cryptocurrencies specifically wanted there not to be a centralized authority that would vet what the currency is. So with a US dollar, the US Mint and the US government ultimately backs and says, this is legitimate currency and it has X value. And they're the only place that could print US currency is the US Mint. I mean, there's several physical places, but the US Mint and the Treasury Department says, this is our currency. And the developers of cryptocurrencies, we don't want that. We want any and everybody to be able to mine Bitcoin, so there's no central authority. So the thing is that complex computer algorithms that have to be solved to make a finite number of Bitcoin or a finite number of Ethereum. And that the solving of those, and the more that there are created in the world, the more complicated the algorithm to make the next one is. And so that's where the energy resource intensiveness is. It's also not quite as intense, but the writing of the token onto the blockchain ledger does take a solving of somewhat complex computer algorithm. So in each of those cases, whether you're mining a coin or minting a token that is an NFT, that is highly energy intensive. And beyond that, beyond the energy intensive, it actually increases the obsolescence of computers, because if you are in that competitive market to mine coins, you need to have the fastest, most powerful computers available. And that basically, so every 14 months, you're going to throw out your computers and get the newest computers. So basically minting an NFT is the equivalent of taking 2 smartphones and throwing them in the trash, because that's how much energy how quickly they make the computers obsolete, and that you've used to mint the coin. So environmentally, NFTs are awful. They're terrible. And that there are efforts to figure out how to decouple the minting of the coins and the writing of the blockchain ledger from these complex algorithms, which is, I mean, right now, in order to have access to write onto the blockchain, you have to show proof of work, which is you've done these computer algorithms. They're trying to switch to a proof of stake model, which basically means you have a certain amount of investment that guarantees that you would not forge anything on the ledger. But there are complicated problems with that. And so right now there aren't really accessible ways to write onto the Ethereum blockchain that is environmentally not screwed up. That may change. I mean, they keep selling us, oh, just around the corner, we're testing the latest Ethereum 2.0. And, you know, just at the beginning of the year, you're going to have the new one. And maybe now it'll be true, but they've been saying that for about 3 years now.
Well, clearly this NFT conversation is something that can be continued, and it may just be continued in a different program, a different conversation. I did actually watch Udred in a different conversation about NFTs, so I know you can talk about them for a while. So at this point, I think we're going to wrap it up, unless there are any last minute questions from the audience. This is your moment.
There's one more in the chat.
Is there one more in the chat? Oh, sorry. Okay, this is from Alicia Gaines. When is a documentary film that was shot during the reenactment coming out, or is it? And secondly, do you see any tension between the move from the community engaged performance that was on the ground in the river parishes to white museum spaces in New York?
Well, first off, the film installation is a collaboration with the artist John Akamfra, who's a badass filmmaker. He's just really amazing. If you don't know his work, check it out. It's AKOMFRAH, John Akamfra. A lot. And so that film will hopefully be completed. It's a multi-channel piece. It's a 5-channel piece. It'll hopefully be completed sometime next year, but we have not committed to a date when it will be released, but you know, it's going to be out, and it's not going to be on Netflix. You're going to have to go to a museum or a gallery to see it. We don't have a premiere venue yet. So there's not much to tell other than when it comes out, it's going to be awesome. And so stay tuned. And as far as, you know, the community engaged versus showing in spaces, I mean, I think that a couple things. One, all of the reenactors wanted this story to be told more broadly, and they knew that it was both being filmed and shot in photography, and that my intent was to, you know, get the conversation to extend beyond the live performance. And so it was, everybody in the collaboration knew that in some ways this was going to have a life beyond the 2 days, and we wanted to figure out the best ways to do that. 2 other things with that. One is that the community engaged aspect, where people participated, there are elements of this project that still live in the heads of people and the networks and dialogues they're having, which is not existing in these spaces. So the community engaged aspect is still going on. Some of the reenactors still meet regular. In fact, I'm just reminding myself that one reenactor has written to say, oh, the anniversary is coming up. We got to we gotta have a conversation about it. And I spaced on responding to the email. And so, but yeah, so people are still meeting and talking and trying to embody this history of freedom and emancipation in different ways. That's not sort of part of the museum spaces, doesn't need them. And that's part of the artwork. And then as far as the museum and gallery spaces, I mean, it's, it's like, I mean, first off, museums are not white spaces. They are spaces that often reproduce a lot of white supremacy, but and structurally, there's a lot of ways in which the leadership and organization of them reinforces white supremacy. But, there are ways in which radical art, including art by artists of color and specifically Black artists, can be transgressive and in these spaces. And I don't consider them sort of a write-off, like nothing to do with that, and to be just really I think because there is so much wealth associated with individual artworks, I think a lot of people in the radicals, people in the arts community have identified that and the need to be on the good graces of very wealthy people to have museum functions as identifying them as deeply problematic, and that in their history with colonialism is a real problem. However, nobody is making that same argument about, say, record companies or Hollywood. And I'm sorry, if you're, say, Public Enemy or The Clash or Kendrick Lamar, you're dealing with some people that got some lots and lots of money, and there's a lot of profit at stake there. If you want to make the film Black Panther, even though it was, Black writers, Black directors, Black, cast, Black, production crew in a lot of ways, and Black producers in a lot of ways, but that studio, it was not an all Black studio, and it was not separated from capitalism. And so I think we need to have a more nuanced understanding of, say, what the Whitney, what the Guggenheim, what SF MoMA, what the High Museum are, which is not to say that we should not hold them accountable for the racism that is historically been what they have promoted, and the fact that they tell a story of American history that has no Black people until like 2 years ago or 3 years ago. There are real problems, but I don't see them as exclusively white spaces. And actually, when I had my first work in a museum show, a museum collection, the Whitney Museum bought a print of mine in 2001 or 2000. The print was from 2001. I think they bought it in 2002. And I walked in and saw it on the walls, maybe 2003. I was delighted that it was there, because I was not the kid that like loved art. I got dragged to art museum once a year because I was a middle-class kid. They dragged us to museums, and I hated the experience because all the crap there was not in my interest. I mean, it's like, I didn't have a worked out theory on this, but I knew this is some boring ass shit. And if I had seen, if young knuckleheaded me could have seen some of the art that I make now, there's a chance that I might have said, well, that's interesting. And also tourists are coming to check out, well, why do Black Americans put up with this crap? Oh, wait, I'm in a Whitney Museum and seeing a man was lynched by police yesterday? Huh. And so I think that there are ways in which these museums actually disseminate culture. And the question in the fight is to get some of that culture to be culture that really represents the interests of people who want to radically transform the world and in the interests of humanity. And so that, it's like, I'm happy when, sort of I go into a museum and I see Simone Lee or John Akamfra or Glenn Ligon or, Latoya Ruby Frazier or Jeffrey Gibson. I think it's great when Jeffrey has a show at the Met, or when the Met is compelled to show other Indigenous artists that, like on their main lobby, that is actually kind of a polemic with some of what their history and collection is. And I think that, we need to have curators really passionate about changing the history of, not changing the history, but changing the future of what they do and challenging the history of what they have been. And, it's like, and just, I'll be blunt, it's like, well, where's the museum show of Slave Rebellion reenactment? This piece, was heralded as one of the most important artworks of the decade by ArtNet. It was written about in 2 articles in 2 articles in the New York Times and the Guardian, written about in Vanity Fair, on CNN. People said it was the most, moving thing they participated in. Audiences were just off the off the charts excited about it. And yet right now, this is not, there's no museum that's like acquired all of any of the flags or all of the prints, and they're not falling all over themselves to show it. And so I'm like, well, all right. So yes, we are, making some progress, that some of these museums are trying to diversify their collection. Some of it's on the easy, like, oh, let's get some abstract stuff. I mean, I like Sam Gilliam, but like if all you do is collect Sam Gilliam, that ain't going to actually cut it, because other Black artists have been doing a lot of good stuff that talks and even what's radical about Sam Gilliam often gets defanged about the ways in which Sam Gilliam is collected, because Sam's actually a very radical artist.
Yep. Sure does.
But I'm just saying, but coming back to, what gets shown, I want, this kind of work needs to be in major spaces. And so if we don't want them to be white spaces, we need to have the most radical flavor that's available up in that joint. So.
On that note, also that reminds, so I want to say, we do need to close, and we will close in a second, but I want to say in this conversation of institutions sort of revisiting their history, I have to mention the National Academy. We are a 200-year-old institution, the second oldest in the country, the oldest artist-run institution. And this conversation about like what's happening inside the institution, these old institutions that left out a lot of voices, left out the people who were amongst the other artists who are in that story. Like we are actively doing that work. And so it's even being here in this virtual space is akin to this idea of like, well, why are you in that white museum space? Like we are also that institution that is actively a space that was only for a certain person, a certain demographic. And we said in the green room, like, look at it, like, for Black people in the green room, like, this is not what this institution was originally made for. And so I think it's an important conversation to talk about like the different spaces and what kind of impact based on who is there and what is happening in those spaces.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, like, that just gave me a whole lot of hope. Because I consider myself somebody as a curator, not just a Black curator, but just a curator in general, who's like on the front line of that fight, like every day, in academic spaces, as well as museums across the country, and with museum professionals, across the country. Like I'll be on strike with the Boston MFA staff tomorrow, for the ways in which there's so many of us, curators, interpreters, educators, registrars, who can totally do exactly what you're saying, like bring slave reenactment, or slave rebellion reenactment, bring that radical work, but we're like stopped from doing so.
Yeah.
Sometimes we're fired for even suggesting it, and it's like that.
Because that's where the slave reenactment is happening, and the enslavers are doing that, but then the slave rebellion reenactment needs to happen. And I just actually got to say one thing. I noticed that somebody put a comment in the chat, Alicia Gaines, who was part of the Army of the Enslaved, and that's the reenactors that embodied this history. And I just want to thank them for coming out to this talk and just that is the foundation of the artwork. I mean, the performance stills get the conversation going. The film gets the conversation into new spaces, but the people that embodied this history, that's the heart of the project.
So one last, I'm not going to have you answer the full question, but Leslie Dill just wanted to know about other slave rebellions before the Civil War. Maybe if you can point people to a resource that you find educational, will help people learn more about slave rebellions, and then we can.
She can get Herbert Aptheker's
yeah, but that's what I was going to say.
Revolts.
Yeah,
that's like the canonical text.
Yeah, so I mean, this is Herbert Aptheker was a white communist dude that decided, okay, we're going to talk about slavery, but we're going to look at slave revolts. And I believe in like the late 30s or maybe early 40s, came out with this American Negro slave revolts. That's the main book, which A, is very, very good and changed scholarship around slavery, and B, the fact that there's one that we're talking about, is tells you everything that you need to know, because again, you can't understand America without understanding slavery. You can't understand slavery without understanding slave revolts. I mean, 10% of the transatlantic, voyages carrying enslaved people had mutinies. These were slave rebellions. There were over 250 slave revolts in the United States of 10 or more people. There was resistance in other forms that, people running away, people forming maroon societies. And so, this is a central part of the story of slavery, and therefore the story of America, and trying to actually understand who were the visionaries who were trying to make a radically better world. And yet that history is not, there's not as much scholarship of it. There are other books, including scholarship of slave revolts, like the Haitian Revolution. There's of course C.L.R. James, the Black Jacobins, but also a new book, Avengers of the New World, which is very good. But there are other books that talk about slave rebellion. And the main book on this slave rebellion that happened in 1811 is a book called On to New Orleans, which is a self-published book by Leon Waters and Albert Thrasher. Albert Thrasher did the writing, Leon Waters published it. And it is telling the story of the largest rebellion of enslaved people that, in US history, that's really, really critical to understand the world. And yet it was, a self-published book that, if you're buying it on Amazon, they're charging you a lot of money for a first edition. And this, Black publisher, will sell it to you basically out of his small internet presence to sell it to you direct and get all the profit. But there needs to be a lot more, the Confessions of Nat Turner talks about Nat Turner's rebellion, and there are others. I mean, the scholarship is out there, but there needs to be a lot more. And they're just, the Appricker book, is the main overview, but there needs to be more, and there may be more, because again, I'm an artist, I'm not a historian, but I do know the field a little bit, and they're just, if you're a scholar out there, this is write the updated Appricker book.
Well, as a historian,
luckily we have a PhD right here, so you're speaking to one.
Something that's like super easy to do is you can Google the most famous ones, right? So you even something as early as Bacon's Rebellion from 1676, 1677, which is really the moment. Bacon's Rebellion is really the moment where slavery becomes a skin, like a marker of skin tone. Because Bacon's Rebellion was a diverse, group of folk. Denmark Vesey's rebellion in, I think, 1837. And you have Stono Rebellion, you have Nat Turner's Rebellion. So if you Google those four, a lot of the scholars who have written about them, will come up. Because like Dred is saying, there's no collection, other than Apthicker's text. But there are a lot of books on each of those particular rebellions, right? And so you can mine the footnotes, and find other sources or the source material that those historians use.
But even Harriet Tubman. So Harriet Tubman was a self-liberated enslaved woman who not only freed herself, but then went back to liberate other enslaved people, which that's the story that people sort of know. But she as part of the Civil War led a raid that the Union Army led, but on the Combahee River, and that she was responsible basically for liberating over 300 people in one revolt, and it was actually a revolt. It was a revolt that was initiated by her and the people on the ground of that region, that was then supported by the federal troops, but it's not thought of as a slave revolt, even though that's what it is. Because the people rose up and were burning down the plantations, and then they had the backing of bigger guns, which was needed to actually do that. But that but that story is told. There's a couple good books about Harriet Tubman, and if you want to look at that, but look specifically for the Combahee River raid.
Thank you for that whole list of books. Everybody has a good reading list, some light reading for the holiday season. So go find these books and educate yourselves on these really important topics. Thank you both so much for joining us tonight. Thank you, Dred. Thank you, Kelli. Thank you everybody for joining us virtually. Next week, we're back again with another conversation. Dr. Kelli Morgan joined us again, this time talking to artist Lorraine Shemesh. That is 7 p.m. next Tuesday. You can RSVP via our website. Angelique dropped the link in the chat there. Thanks for joining us. It was so great to have you guys here.
Thank you for having us. Good night.
Good night, everybody.